Hello, folks. I want to talk to you today about my frustrations about a few things I've seen in the political campaigns and on Twitter. Uh, the newest critique of Bernie Sanders' campaign is that he has pivoted on his deportation moratorium, and that is the only way to pronounce that word. If you try and correct me, you're fucking wrong. Anyway, Bernie's deportation moratorium would not be a full halt. People serving time for violent crimes would not be protected under Bernie's new plan, and this was an issue for Bernie's supporters who are very progressive and didn't like this, but also for Donut Twitter, which seems to have grabbed hold of this and is now trying to ask the question of why, because they can't say that their candidate is better than Bernie on this because none of them are. So they have to ask the question in order to attack Bernie Sanders. They have to ask why isn't his supporters speaking out on it. In a tweet thread with all of his supporters critiquing Bernie Sanders about it. There's not a single possible person. I haven't seen rarely anybody that's praised it. So this is the kind of lies that donut Twitters will put out there. And it asks the question, who are they trying to convince? They're obviously not trying to convince over Bernie Sanders supporters if they're blatantly lying and they know that they're lying in front of them. It's just sad to kind of see that from liberals nowadays. So I'm just really upset about that. But let's get back to the point here. This begs the question of why these detractors are attacking Bernie if immigrant groups are still supporting Bernie and have claimed that his plans are the best overall, and that's because they do not hold their candidate responsible. Warren supporters in particular have pushed this terrible narrative, and it appears that the supporters still in the Warren camp are actually just really leftovers and former Hillary supporters. And this is an issue, obviously, because of her racist attacks that her campaign has levied against Obama with the birther movement that she created with her campaign, as well as the Burner Bros narratives that is also racist against the minorities that make up the majority of the coalition and the Bernie campaign. Warren supporters have constantly attacked Sanders supporters, and Sanders personally. They rarely attack his policies or positions, and rarely have a discussion on the topic. Instead, we hear Donut Bros crying about Bernie supporting Cuba's dictator. I can't really take these critiques seriously when, Warren, and unrelated to this issue, but very related for supporters and what they critique their own candidates on. Warren agreed with Betsy DeVos on private education when she quoted as saying, "Fully funded vouchers would relieve parents from the terrible choice of leaving their kids in lousy schools or bankrupting themselves to escape those schools." That kind of bullshit is just ridiculous, and that's really concerning as somebody that is a progressive, that somebody would, try to agree with Betsy DeVos of all people, and especially on private education. But the more important thing is agreeing with Betsy DeVos, who is a terrible person. These are real quotes. It is a real issue with supporting Warren. It's not taking her out of context. It's something that she agrees with and is expanded by the fact that she has an endorsement of this issue and is not a qualifier before a critique at all. Which is completely different from this Cuba thing, which I would like to get into a little bit more detail here. Bernie claimed that Cuba has made improvements in their education system and in their healthcare system. Not only is this true, but Obama said the exact same thing in a speech that he gave. I would expect this from conservatives, but liberals are acting really weird and just terrible. I have to treat them as if they are conservatives now on the same level, that they're just inherently dishonest. Here's a video, actually, of Obama speaking about Cuba, saying the same things that Bernie says.
And I said this to President Castro in Cuba. I said, look, you've made great progress in educating young people. Every child in Cuba gets a basic education. That's a huge improvement from where it was. Medical care. The life expectancy of Cubans is equivalent to the United States, despite it being a very poor country, because they have access to health care. That's a huge achievement.
So as you can see, they're the exact same things. So you can praise areas that someone has made improvements in while showcasing areas in which they need to address and improve. To ignore this is to be ignorant of the subject you are discussing. Blind hatred to what your country tells you to hate is the same type of mentality that led Trump and conservatives to defend the bombing of military personnel in Iraq that almost led to a war. The discussions that were had about that were halted due to the fact that people only wanted to focus on the idea of whether that person was bad or not wanted to have the discussion that other people were wanting to discuss, which was that it was a bad decision to have because of the ramifications of that. Propaganda does that, and you're feeding directly into that. Moving on to more issues, I take with Donut Twitter. I don't see Warren supporters actively campaigning against supporting progressive politicians and candidates. This is alarming to me. Now, I know that this sounds like an anecdotal thing, but I find it extra concerning that Warren supporters do not find Sanders supporters as progressive allies. If you go on Twitter, if you go on the YouTube sphere space, if you listen to these people talk and you hear them, they're not out there helping progressives, these Warren people. They're not doing that. They're not trying to build a coalition or a political campaign. And Bernie Sanders has a huge amount of people. And whether you think Bernie Bros is a real thing or not, you can't dispute facts. And facts are, in the polls and the votes that have happened so far in this political cycle, has shown that Bernie Sanders has one of the most diverse voter sets and had a huge Hispanic voter base, and you're just going to dismiss them entirely. This just seems like such a entitled white feminist thing where they don't worry about anything that pertains to race, which is expounded upon. Excuse me, that's not even a word. That is expanded upon by the fact that these people are mostly a lot of them are related to the Hillary campaigns in which they launched these racist attacks against her opponents. It's very, very concerning to me. Um, Getting back on topic, there seems to be some disconnect with the Donut Bros whenever they speak about Bernie and their issues with his Bernie Bros come up. The Donut Bros cannot vote or discuss anything based on policy in many instances, instead pursuing a path that's easier for them that is reliant on critiquing Twitter followers and supporters. This raises questions as when Donut Bros are talking to Bernie Bros, they can't separate the candidate from the supporter they are speaking to. In their heads, any candidate supporters are bound to their candidate's actions and viewpoints and vice versa, and they can never change at any points. How you could build a political campaign and gather votes from based off of this model is beyond me. This is problematic too, as it paints a wide and diverse coalition as one singular vision, which is just not the case with our progressive candidates. It also hurts themselves and the progressive movement as a whole. Main objectives for these people should be to move more voters to accepting a more progressive or socialist political movement, and this objective can't be achieved by making assumptions and playing identity politics with potential future allies. On Twitter, at Dante Atkins said he is a supposed progressive communicator and is a big supporter of Elizabeth Warren, has critiqued Bernie for campaigning in Massachusetts. That's not me taking him out of context. He is mad because Bernie is focusing and doing two campaigns in Massachusetts, where Ward is from, and it says, "Why isn't he voting on California and other places?" The critique comes at the assumption by Dante that Bernie is campaigning in Massachusetts solely to take delegates away from Warren. First of all, why is that an issue, even if that was the case? But Dante, this is so stupid. Dante characterizes this as petty, too. I'm not even going to go into detail. I'm just going to let that marinate with you. Just realize what Donut Twitter is doing out there. That's their critique of people. Dante, along with surrogates from Warren's campaign, have tried critiquing Sanders for having no plan to Medicare for all. This is why we could tell that Warren's campaign is run by establishment Democrats and not progressives. A progressive would have critiqued the plan that Bernie has released instead of lying and saying that Bernie does not have a plan. If you don't know what his plan is, you could go to his website or look at the fucking images on your screen right now, because it took me 2 seconds to find them. Now, if Donut Twitter was trying to engage Sanders supporters and convince them that their candidate had a flaw, they would actively critique the plan Sanders has in place and release to the public. There's nothing wrong with that. That's in fact a great thing to do. I would vote for somebody. I don't care if it is Sanders or somebody else. I'm voting for the person that has the best policies and is going to progress this country in the best way, and is going to have the protection and foresight to protect people, minorities especially included, because they have been forgotten in this country for so long. But that's not the case, because they are instead lying and saying that Sanders hasn't released his medical records, his tax records, or his plan to finance Medicare for all. I can speak confidently on this because I have had discussions with these people, and they have constantly tried to push back against me and say that he has not done this yet. And all I had to do was go on Twitter and on Google, and Google these things and found them. It's ridiculous what they are out there putting this smear campaign, and I don't know what their mindset is. Like, how are you supposed to gain voters this way? Are you just going to ignore the most popular candidates' voting base? You're just going to say, I don't need his votes. Don't worry, I'll just lie. What? Like, how is any of Sanders' supporters going to sign off on board on this when they see that you're actively a terrible person and a liar, and in many cases, y'all are a bunch of racists? The next question that a Sanders supporters would have when faced with these issues is, why is Donut Twitter lying about these issues? Well, the answer is simple. Donut Twitter is trying to convince people who are not knowledgeable about the discussion. Donut Twitter is trying to persuade undivided voters and other candidates that Sanders is a liar and can't be trusted. This is proof that Warren's supporters and the Democratic Party at large are not allies. I know this is obvious to progressive or Sanders supporters, but I need to clarify this for those who aren't familiar with the dialogue going on right now in the political space. Donut Twitter has taken a page out of Trump's and the alt-right's playbook, and has decided to throw as many accusations and lies against the walls as they can and see what sticks. Putting progressives and the Sanders voter base on the defensive is their mindset and strategy. Donut Twitter believes this will defeat Sanders, but even they recognize that it isn't a viable strategy to have their particular candidate elected, which is why they choose and prefer to not even mention a candidate when they critique him or in their profiles for the most part. This is why I take huge issue with this strategy and why I hate Donut Twitter. We have also seen Donut Twitter take Russia propaganda and run with it, as an obvious ploy to sow the seeds of dissent among the Democratic Party. It is surprising that Donut Twitter will actively feed into and spread the Russian propaganda while Trump is parroting their words. These Donut Bros are bad-mouthing Trump one second while regurgitating his exact propaganda the next second. Jake Tapper, that name, I can never pronounce it right. CNN and the national security briefings of the United States confirmed that the interference was not done to help Bernie get elected. It's quite sad that Donut Twitter is playing into the hands of Russian propaganda in exactly the way they wanted, even while their motives are actively known and have been reported upon. It begs the question then of why Donut Twitter believes in their delusional world that Russia is trying to get Bernie elected. They cannot answer this question seriously. They can't have this discussion and will instead change the subject in order to keep their propaganda afloat. I do understand that these people are not actually looking to improve the country for the most part. These people are focused on their individual self, which lends to their political viewpoints. Poll after poll show that Bernie does better against Trump than any other candidate. Even though Donut Twitter exclaims that they want to beat Trump no matter what, and will vote blue no matter who, they will kick and scream the whole way. These pushbacks will continue and are going to be the excuses for why liberals will either stay at home or vote for Trump or a third party. And at the end of the day, I don't have an issue with this action by itself. Your most powerful voice is your vote, and it isn't limited to just voting for who you want in office. You can hold power by choosing not to vote in an election as a protest to the political party that you are a part of if they do not elect a candidate that represents your values. Now, this, of course, is harmful in the short run, But in the long run, it can move your party to where you want it to be. As we have seen so much over these past 20 years and probably 30 years, probably more than that. But we have seen how far right Democrats and liberals will go in order to capture this moderates. But besides that point, this is an issue, is that they're not using their votes to try and hold the Democratic Party responsible to get their voices heard about the issues they care about. That's not what they're doing. Donut Twitter isn't threatening their vote because Bernie doesn't represent their viewpoints. He has very agreeable policies for the most part, and finding a difference between Warren and Bernie is not on where they stand for the most part, but how they will implement their policies. This is frustrating as it appears that hatred has blinded these individuals. Twitter has pushed forward a toxic and limited space to have discussion about these issues, but it's not limited to Twitter for these smears and mindsets. I will end by saying this. At some point, when Bernie Sanders does win the nomination, we will have to convince these people to be on our side. And we do have to hold ourselves accountable and hold ourselves to a higher standards by not attacking these people and critiquing them and showcasing why they're terrible people and trying to shun them from our party because of the toxic and racist things they do on the daily. And if you think I'm lying, ask Warren Sanders why she had a surrogate named Ashley Preston who was a terrible racist. Yeah, well, I'm not going to get into that. But at the end of the day, Sanders supporters have to be held to a higher standards that the liberals and Warren supporters and Hillary bros and donut twitters are not held to. And that's something that we will have to do. And it is frustrating, but I hope that I have told a little bit about why I'm frustrated. If somebody wants to know why Bernie Bros are upset or angry at any point in time, it's because we have to deal with not only the conservative party, but also liberals having to pull this bullshit. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say because I ramble on. So if you have any disagreements, I don't care. Thank you. Goodbye.